Europeans have got a great idea. They're ready to go. It's an open door. But Mr. President, I would recommend that you really push to get this done now, so that they can buy weapons from us. This is fine. Use those funds to be able to reinforce what we're sending to the Ukraine and amp it up. So more weapons, more volume, more range, more capabilities, and using the Russian money. I mean, this is Russian money that could be used right now. So those would be my recommendations to you.
Hello and welcome to Independence Avenue Media. I'm Meurmishvili, and my guest today is Ambassador William Taylor. Ambassador Taylor served as America's ambassador to Ukraine, and in 2019-2020, he went back to Kyiv as charge d'affaires. Today, we'll talk about the latest developments related to the war in Ukraine, about the U.S. policy towards Ukraine, and of course, President Trump's statements related to Ukraine, NATO, and Russia. And with that, Ambassador Taylor, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yesterday and day before yesterday, we saw lots of activity related to Ukraine coming from Washington and from President Trump himself. Let's talk about the Truth Social tweet or the post for a little bit. He basically made fun of Russia. He said that Russian economy is in a big trouble. And he said that Ukraine can win, which is the first time, at least I remember, remember that U.S. administration mentioned the word win in this context. So what do you make of that whole post?
It's very interesting. Yeah, I totally agree. I haven't seen anything like that from either administration, either the previous administration or the current administration, to talk about winning and talk about taking back all of the land. Talk about going back to 1991 borders. Must have been a good meeting with President Zelenskyy, because apparently President Trump came out of that meeting and shortly thereafter sent out this post which, as you say, had a couple of things in it. One was this expectation, the possibility, that the Ukrainians could win and take back this territory, and also, as you just mentioned, talk about the Russian weakness. Talk about the economy is weak, that it is militarily weak. It's not been doing well on the battlefield. Didn't do well on the battlefield at the beginning. There was this. So it must have been an interesting conversation between President Trump and President Zelenskyy on that. And maybe it was reinforced by some briefings that President Trump got, either before, in preparation for these meetings, or after the meetings. But he did seem to be pretty sure that the Russian economy was doing poorly, and of course the Ukrainians have been contributing to that. They've been bombing refineries and have taken out a fifth of the refining capacity. There are lines apparently at gas stations that there are falling revenues for exports. All to say that the Ukrainians are doing pretty well. The Russians are struggling. The Russians clearly were irritated by that post. They, Medvedev, as usual, kind of pipes up, kind of pathetic. But what it does show is the Russians heard it and were not pleased, and that's a good thing.
Do you think this will continue this way? I know it's a trick question to ask, but how do you think things can move on from here? Can we go back to the time when, for example, Trump was calling Zelenskyy a dictator?
You're right. No one knows. No one can say for sure. What I think we can discern, though, is that there's been a gradual trend of increasing support for Ukraine and even for President Zelenskyy, and a gradual expression of irritation, series of expressions of irritation or frustration or anger or from Trump about Putin. And those two things have been going on for a couple of months. What we saw the past 2 days was an acceleration of that, was a steep acceleration of those two trends, that is, increased support for Ukraine and decreased support for Russia. There was one big change which we've already talked about, and that is this issue of territory. I haven't heard any U.S. official, previous administration or this administration, make the claim that Ukraine could take back all the 1991 territory, 1991 borders. You and I heard, over the last weekend from some soldiers who were determined to take back all that territory. That may have not, it might not have been the majority view in that room in Kyiv where we were, but there were certainly some soldiers and others who were determined that they would not give up any land, any Ukrainian land, to the Russians. So this is a good thing.
No. Let's talk about the European side of this. President Trump, in the same post, said that, well, NATO will continue with NATO's help, or European Union's help, to purchase weapons for Ukraine. Ukraine can basically win. That was the idea. What do you think about that? Do you think this is a good path that the Western communities on right now, that NATO and the EU countries are buying weapons and sending them to Ukraine?
I think the best path would be for the United States to be contributing to the purchase, to the provision of those weapons for Ukraine directly. The next best thing is what we've got now, and that is the Europeans, a collection of rich countries, let's be clear, buying weapons from U.S. manufacturers and providing them to the Ukrainians. That can get the job done. That can get the job done. Plus, the other thing, you and I heard last weekend that was encouraging, I thought, was this new momentum behind the drive by the Europeans primarily, but supported by Americans, to use that $300 billion of Russian central bank assets that are frozen in Western banks. You and I heard some good ideas, some interesting ideas that the EU has come up with that would get around the legal back and forth, the legal skirmishing, the legal concerns about whether or not it's okay under international law to seize these $300 billion that are in these banks and actually provide it to the Ukrainians. Well, the Europeans have come up with an idea of a loan. They call it Ukraine reparation loan, and the idea is that if we use those funds, the $300 billion, can be loaned to Ukraine for purchases of weapons, as an example, or after the war ends, to help rebuild the country. But these funds would be loaned to the Ukrainians and would only be paid back when the Russians pay reparations. I think that's a clever move. I think that's a very clever move, and it gets the money to the Ukrainians to buy weapons right away.
And it seems that that idea, the one that you just described, has more traction than some others that we've heard.
It's really true. There have been a lot of concern. This idea, of course, has been around for a long time. It's been around for 3.5 years. But it has been debated by the international lawyers. And even if the international lawyers, of which there are many, who say this is legal, this can be done, this is okay under international law, but even if they're right, it would be in court. Somebody would go to court if the nations, the European nations, and the United States were to actually seize these funds from the banks. It'd be tied up in court. I'm prepared to believe that. And this new solution, this clever idea of a loan to be paid back only when Russia pays reparation, I think that I'm told that gets around that legal problem, that this is cleaner from an international law standpoint.
Bill, you just, as you mentioned, you were in Kyiv, we were in Kyiv just a week ago. What are the impressions that you came back this time? And this is not, of course, not your first time. You've been there many times since the full-scale invasion. So, do you see any sort of evolution of whether it's the morale or how Ukraine is getting stronger militarily on this path? Like, what are your overall observations?
So two issues. One is the last thing that you mentioned here, which is the Ukrainians' military industrial capabilities have really blossomed, have really expanded. And their production, yes, of drones. Drones is the headline and a very important, probably the most important component of this industrial expansion, but not the only one. The Ukrainians are as I understand it, you and I heard the same kind of things that Ukrainians are that the weapons the Ukrainians are using on the battlefield today, 40 to 50% of those weapons being used are being manufactured in Ukraine. That's incredible. That's incredible. This expansion of that capability. So that's impressive. Yes, the Europeans provide another 30%, and the Americans provide the last whatever 20%, and some of that last 20% are the Patriots and more sophisticated weapons that are only manufactured in the United States. But nonetheless, this expansion of the capabilities of the Ukrainians, I think, was very impressive. And as you recall, there was a lot of discussion of that a week ago. The second thing that struck me coming out of Kyiv last weekend was kind of this dual track. On the one hand, the Ukrainians and, frankly, the Europeans want to keep the Americans on board. They want to keep President Trump on side. They want to maintain support from the United States in all kinds of ways. Militarily on weapons, but politically, economically, sanctions. They do want to be sure that the Americans in this administration the Americans are continuing to provide that kind of support in all those domains. That's the one track. There's another track, which is to make plans for when the first track doesn't work. That is, there are concerns. You've already referred to them, Mia, that the American policy could change, or that the American policy is fine now, but it might not be in the future. And so this other track that the Ukrainians and the Europeans are on is we need to get ready to defend ourselves. The Ukrainians and Europeans need to be able to pursue this war, to manufacture the weapons that we need, to provide the military leadership in NATO or in this coalition of the willing that can provide the military support to Ukraine to stop the Russians in Ukraine. So there are two tracks. One is try to keep the Americans on board, but second is, just in case, build up the capabilities on the European-Ukrainian side.
Do you think President Trump's state visit to the UK had anything to do with his, I don't want to call it change of heart, but clearly a different direction that he's taking lately?
It's a good question. The timing would suggest that that this change took place after the president got back and had good meetings with the king and good meetings with the prime minister. He received all of the honors and all the things that the Brits do so well there, and clearly President Trump enjoyed that. And so the political message or the policy message coming from the Brits to the Americans, from the leaders to President Trump, probably got a sympathetic hearing, which maybe in conjunction, we don't know this, I don't know this, but maybe in conjunction with the briefings from our intelligence on, for example, the state of the Russian economy, or the capabilities of the Ukrainians, all of which could have been reinforced then with President Trump's conversation with President Zelenskyy, which could have echoed what the Brits had told him a week ago. All to say that this is going in the same direction. As I mentioned earlier, I think the trend is right on support for Ukraine and decreasing support or interest in working with the Russians.
As you may recall, President Zelensky, when he was meeting with President Trump at the UN, Zelensky sort of gave a briefing at Trump's request to overview the situation on the battlefield. And Zelensky said that about 1,000 Russian troops are surrounded right now by the Ukrainian troops. And that reminded me of the time when Putin was telling President Trump that Russians had surrounded Ukrainian soldiers, and Trump wanted to save all of those surrounded. So it's a very interesting sort of change of dynamics and situation here. And maybe, as you said, based on the intelligence analysis or other information that President Trump is getting, maybe he is seeing that Russia is not advancing on the battlefield as Putin may have been telling him.
Exactly right. And unfortunately, it's not just Putin that was putting out this message. Oh, the Russians are on the move, and the Ukrainians are falling back. That was coming, yes, from a lot of reporting. It wasn't true. The Ukrainians have been holding. What is true, of course, is the Russians have been grinding at incredible cost in terms of Russian lives, which Putin doesn't apparently care about. But they've been taking a crossroads here and a small village there and a kilometer here. But they have not been winning. The Russians are not winning. They're not even progressing very operationally, certainly not strategically. So there is that, and I think that is becoming clearer now. I mean, that was kind of the message. That was the storyline coming out, that the Russians are on the move. Well, they're not. And I think these combination of discussions and briefings may have dispelled that line.
I remember we've been talking about, in media, I've interviewed a number of people about Pokrovsk. And we've started talking about that one city 2 years ago. And
Yes.
2 years ago, it was almost about to be taken by the Russians. And 2 years later, we're still here when Russians have not been able to do it.
You're
So that's
absolutely right.
an indication of how Russia is basically grinding, for 1 meter here and 1 kilometer there. But
Exactly.
Bill, I would like to ask you the final questions. Based on your vast diplomatic experience, if you were to be advising President Trump right now, what would be your policy recommendation from this point on? How do you see this? What is the best case scenario from the U.S. side on the policy level?
Thanks, Ia. I would be recommending to President Trump that he build on the advantage that he has already described. President Trump has described a real advantage on the part of the West, on the part of Ukraine, on the part of Europe, on the part of the United States, on the part of NATO, in the face of a Russian weakness. So I would be advising President Trump to increase the pressure on the Russians right now, and you increase the pressure in a multitude of ways. You put sanctions on every economic way, sanctions, tariffs, more enforcement of the existing sanctions that reduces the flow of funds into the Russian economy that they use to then pursue the war, and reduce those revenues, starve the Russian economy and the Russian war machine of the resources that they need. So, and now's the time. The Russians are weak in that regard. That's number one. And number two, the weapons that the Ukrainians need. And again, Trump has talked about, if they got the support, they can take back. Well, fine, Mr. President. They can do that. They need the long range weapons. They need the long range weapons that we have. They've got even longer range. I mean, the Ukrainians have got weapons that are longer than our ATACMS. ATACMS have a bigger warhead and a heavier warhead, do bigger damage, but nonetheless, the Ukrainians have this. But give them what they need in terms of taking this fight into military targets in Russia, and give them as many of the Patriot systems as they can to protect their cities and their soldiers. On the military side, on the economic side, and then on the political side, this gets into the economics as well. Push hard on this 300 billion. Make this money available. Push the Europeans have got a great idea. They're ready to go. It's an open door. But Mr. President, I would recommend that you really push to get this done now, so that they can buy weapons from us. This is fine. Use those funds to be able to reinforce what we're sending to the Ukrainians and amp it up. So more weapons, more volume, more range, more capabilities, and using the Russian money. I mean, this is Russian money that could be used right now. So those would be my recommendations to you.
Ambassador Bill Taylor, thank you very much for joining us today. I do appreciate your time.
Glad to be here anytime. Thanks to you.